Welcome to Diagnosing Dx, the podcast giving diagnostics the platform it deserves. While therapeutics and devices often take center stage, diagnostics is the engine driving precision medicine. I'm your host, David Philby, and each week we spotlight the innovators, breakthroughs, and real-world challenges shaping the future of DX. In this episode of Diagnosing DX, I'm joined by Brad Murray, CEO and co-founder of Delve Bio. Brad shares how his journey through academia, biotech, and venture capital shaped his approach to building diagnostics that put patients first. We discuss why execution, not just vision, is the key to survival in today's market, how Delve is transforming infectious disease diagnostics with metagenomic sequencing, and the real impact this has for patients with life-threatening infections. Well, welcome to the show, Brad, this week. I'm really excited to have you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. David, how are you?
I'm really good. Yeah, I'm really good. I'm actually really excited about this because you guys have had a load of good press on many different formats. I think I've seen you on NBC at one point, and so there's been some really cool press around the company. So I'm excited to get into what you guys are doing, what your science is. But before we do that, it'd be great to get an introduction from yourself and your background, who you are, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so David, and for your listeners, my name's Brad Murray. I'm the CEO and co-founder here at Delve Bio. My personal background and kind of my career journey started. I was originally interested in medicine and wanted to become a doctor, and found out quite quickly during undergrad studies that was not for me. And then from there, through a couple twists and turns and summer internships in college, ended up, really quite interested in genomics and computational biology. And fortuitously ended up in Matthew Meyerson's lab at Harvard and the Broad Institute as a computational biologist, where I spent about 2.5 years doing large-scale genomics and cancer genomics in Matthew's lab. And Matthew was one of the discoverers of the mutations in epithelial growth factor receptor, EGFR, for non-small cell lung cancer that drives standard of care for about 1/3 of those patients today. So helped build the Cancer Genome Atlas when I was in Matthew's lab, and do quite a bit of analysis for that project, and then a little early drug discovery work. And that really, I always look back on that experience as kind of a foundational experience for me, and something that I view as, really setting me up with a good training and a substantive interest in really doing great science. I left his lab for industry, really with an interest in, okay, what does it take to turn this great academic work that I now have experience doing into real medicines. So I joined a company, Intellia Therapeutics, right around the time they were getting off the ground. So it was just a few of us in a shared office space in Cambridge, Massachusetts, really trying to get some of the earliest data generated for what in vivo gene editing based medicines with CRISPR-Cas9 would look like. Now, both of those projects are now in phase 3 clinical trials, NTLA 2001 and NTLA 2002, for the treatment of transthyretin amyloidosis and hereditary angioedema, respectively. So I spent about 5 years there doing a lot of genomics for genetic medicine development. I left Intellia with a desire now to, okay, I've seen what academic science looks like, truly great academic science. I've seen what truly great drug development looks like. What does it take to be an investor? So I spent about 2 years with Chris Garabedian at Zontogeny and the Perceptive Advisors Venture Fund, doing seed Series A, Series B biotech medtech work, where we were running a smaller seed fund, writing checks up to $2 or $3 million, but a larger venture fund where we had the ability to write checks up to $50 million really across the life science spectrum. And I got to look at, hey, 600 companies in 2 years. So a really phenomenal experience there. And the way my brain works is I'm a pattern recognition mind. Um, so looking at that many companies and seeing what good looks like and seeing what bad looks like and seeing the distribution there, was really, really helpful for me when I started looking at, okay, what do I want something that I'm going to build to look like? What are the components of that? What is going to be important to that company? What are we going to deliver? So I started, um, at the beginning of 2022, started thinking about what's next for me. At this point, I feel like I had done a lot of the work where I felt like I was ready uh, to go build a company. So I spent time with Matthew. So Matthew Meyerson, who I worked with at Harvard in the Broad, um, to kind of start thinking about some of those ideas. And we partnered with Joe DeRisi, Michael Wilson, Charles Chu, Party Sabetti, UCSF, to really get this company off the ground. And it took our founding group, the 5 academic co-founders of mine and myself, about a year to do it. So we spent almost all of 2022 building a business plan, meeting with investors, negotiating a license, um, doing a little bit of work on our most early hires, before launching in January of 23, with our operation. So that's been the history of Dell thus far.
Wow. Brad, it feels like you've almost done a lifetime of experience, but condensed into the sort of foundational early years of your career. Because how many people get the opportunity to spend time in the academic research, go into a private startup field and see that journey, a successful journey as well, right? Into the fact they're in phase 3 now, and then go into the investment side. It sort of feels like you've got these incredible perspectives that sometimes it takes people 40 years to gather that sort of perspective in the industry. Was that intentional for you, or was that something that at each stage you found yourself sort of interested in something and a different perspective and then pursued it?
I would call it semi-intentional,
Yeah.
um, but I'm I'm naturally a pretty curious person,
Yeah.
and I don't like being very focused on like a singular discipline.
Mm.
I like to be a very multidisciplinary person. So at any time I've went out and gathered a new experience, I've really been seeking something that can expand my capabilities and my skills as a entrepreneur, an executive, or an investor, or even an individual contributor. I've really tried to do that. And that's what's driven some of those moves. Now, I've always had this North Star. That is, I want to build something of my own. I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to be a CEO.
Right.
So a lot of the things I've gone and done have been with that North Star in mind.
Yeah.
And I think, I look at my experiences at the Broad and at Intelia and with Chris at Ontogeny and Perceptive, um, as really helping me put those pieces together. I saw, hey, okay, what does great science look like? What does great drug development look like? And what is blue blood? Perceptive is one of the best
Mm.
blue chip hedge funds in the entirety of life sciences. Um, what does it look like to be a truly great life science investor?
Yeah.
And I got to see all of those things in action. I got to see John Leonard at Intelia, who's, he was the guy who led the development team for Humira, which is one of the best selling drugs ever.
Mm.
Uh, and I got to see how he acts and how he, builds teams and how he develops drugs. And that's kind of learned through osmosis there.
Yeah. That's awesome. Why did you want to be a founder? Why did you want to be a CEO?
I tell my team this, I like to get my hands dirty. I'm a hands-on founder, CEO. I'm very much want to know the details. Um, I want to I want to build. I think that's very, very important to me. Um, and that's really why I wanted to start this company is, why I wanted to start a company in the first place. And we can talk more about why Delve. Um, but my desire to really get my hands dirty, build something that is meaningful and impactful for patients. Um, that's really what drove this.
That's awesome. And the time on the investment side, obviously you did a pretty significant stint there, as almost 5 years. Did that, I mean, how did that benefit that chasing that North Star and working on the investment side, seeing 600 different opportunities there, which obviously not all of them would have been successful, but assessing 600 opportunities for the companies that were looking to raise capital, did that just fuel that ambition more? And sort of, what were the benefits of working on the investment side before you went and started Delve, before we get into that? At Alevra Consulting, we focus on DX only, supporting early stage and growth companies achieve their milestones by solving their biggest talent challenges. Have you ever suffered from working with a talent partner who was either life sciences or med tech and dabbling in diagnostics? Well, no more. Work with a diagnostics specialist talent partner.
Yeah, and it gets back to wanting to kind of fuel my ability to recognize patterns.
Mm,
Um, Looking at all those companies, I mean, most investors are investing in 1% of the opportunities
right.
they see. And I think that was consistent with my experience. I think, I looked at 600 companies and I might have done 6 or 7 deals. So it's pretty
Wow.
consistent with that 1% number. But what I learned is I learned what good looks like. I learned what bad looks like, even if I may not have invested in either of them. But I learned that. And one of my big, big takeaways, because I was an investor through the peak and then probably the first year of um, kind of the pullback that we've seen in
Yeah.
life sciences over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And you saw pretty clearly during that time that the market was quite penal to those that hadn't like really executed. And that was one of my big, big, big takeaways is, there is a premium on execution and your ability to deliver what you say you're going to deliver when you say you're going to deliver it. Um, we're not in a market where there's a premium put on vision nearly as much. Um, so being very, very focused, generating great data, delivering great product or great drug development services or drug development milestones or great clinical data, that is where the world is at, is you have to execute. Um, and that's how I look at what we do. It's we have a tremendous focus on execution. It's something I learned um, as an investor is the premium on execution will live across market cycles, and it's robust to market cycles. Um, Whereas I think where biotech kind of got over its skis is it was a little early. It was a little probably too visionary, and frankly, it wasn't delivering enough drugs or diagnostics to patients that it needed to be doing. And I think the correction has helped with quite a bit of that. There are winners and losers in the correction.
Sure.
And the winners are the ones who've generated great clinical data. The winners are the ones who've scaled commercial growth of a diagnostic. Um, and the losers are the opposite.
Do you think that still there's I completely agree with what you're saying in terms of in the pullback and the added caution and scrutiny and due diligence put into any transaction is healthy for the industry long term, as long as we are able to maintain that standard when things get better. right? Because when things boom, do we just drop all that again and just cash start flowing again? And that's always creates these problems. But do you think that's where a lot of early stage founders get it wrong, that they focus on the science too much without the proof, without the data, without the execution? Because a lot of these people are sort of, maybe they're coming straight out of academics, right, as founders. Do you think that's where these early stage founders tend to get it wrong in the current landscape?
Well, so I'll tell you my opinion on kind of the early stage founder stuff. Is I think it's great. I think there's been a lot of movement around, supporting, fresh out of academia founders,
Yeah.
first time founders. I'm a first time founder.
Yeah.
I think the Nucleate movement is one of them, where I've done some mentorship there. It's been fantastic experience for me. I think anyone can do it, frankly. I think we should be seeking out from any and every discipline and walk of life and training background, people who can really execute. But it's, hey, North Star, wake up every morning and say, how am I going to get this to patients today? What is my next step to get this thing that I'm working on to patients? And I think that's, to me, when I take a step back and maybe out of the weeds, that's a really, really important question to always ask yourself. And, another interesting question, way to ask that is, given the capital I have, how am I going to do that? And that it's an easier way. It forces you to sometimes, really think hard about that. You only have a finite amount of capital. What am I going to do with that to help patients? And I think that's a very, very useful perspective, that we like to use here at Delve, and I've seen others use.
Yeah, nice. So let's go into Delve. So this is what we're here to talk about. So who are Delve, and why was Delve the right company for you, to launch?
Sure. So, Delve is fundamentally based on trying to change the type of questions that infectious disease physicians ask and molecular microbiologists ask during diagnosis. So instead of, hypothesis driven, so a physician looks at a patient and has a hypothesis that this patient might have COVID-19 or mycobacteria tuberculosis or coccidioides or, herpes simplex virus, or, the list goes on and on. They have tools to ask those questions. They have molecular tools to ask those questions. They have PCR, they have culture, they have antigen testing, they have serological testing. They have some very, very basic next generation sequencing tools. So they can go and ask that hypothesis. They can get a yes or no on COVID. They can get a yes or no on tuberculosis, and so on and so forth. Our view when we look at that is that's a piecemeal process. It takes time. Patients might go through many different sample acquisitions, and depending on the indication, that could be as simple as a basic blood draw, or it could be as complicated as a lumbar puncture, in the space that we're operating in, which is in central nervous system infections. So it's a piecemeal process, really, prolongs the diagnostic odyssey, and all the while, patients are suffering and their condition is worsening, as well as healthcare resources are getting expended. So it's a lot of this we think is driven by diagnostics, and our platform technology, which is metagenomic next generation sequencing, which is really a fancy way of saying we read all the nucleic acids in the sample. So all the DNA, all of the RNA, both cellular and cell-free. And we do that out of cerebral spinal fluid now, and have a vision to do that out of many, many different sample types in the future. But we read everything, and we use our computational platform, called Delve Detect and Delve Decide, to actually deconvolute that and deliver diagnoses. Um, and the way we think about how we change that hypothesis-driven question to a hypothesis-free one is going from asking, hey, do you have COVID? Do you have tuberculosis? To what is there? And that's the diagnosis that we deliver with our commercial product, Delve Detect CSF, for central nervous system infections broadly nationwide.
And so the impact on patients, for example, is someone goes in with some sort of symptom. Previously, it's a slightly guessing game, an educated guessing game, and potentially a long drawn out process. How is the patient benefiting from this new platform that you're bringing to market?
Yeah, so you just help you understand the patient journey a little bit more. Patients will walk into the ER, typically experiencing fever, altered mental status.
Yeah.
They might get some simple clinical chemistries, maybe an MRI, um, and if there's suspicion of central nervous system infection, oftentimes look at a lumbar puncture to access cerebral spinal fluid, and some very basic testing will get run on that. Most hospitals have, culture, a basic rapid in-house PCR, um, and they'll also do quite a bit of cell count, protein counting, glucose
Mm.
counting, to kind of get a complete clinical picture, to inform the physician's decision making there. Um, at that point, you know, only about 50% of central nervous systems are diagnosed by that standard of care protocol. So there's quite a bit left on the table. And what we've now shown 3 times over, twice, um, or once by my founders, in 2019 in the New England Journal, once Delve with our co-founders, more recently with a real world evidence study, and then most recently at American Society of Microbiology, in partnership with Ben Bradley and Kim Hansen at University of Utah and ARUP. We've shown, 22 to 30% of patients, we could increase that diagnostic yield. So it's going from 50 going 22 to 30% more than that. So really a substantive increase in the diagnostic yield over standard of care processes. And that's really how we think about our initial positioning is those 50% who don't get diagnoses today,
Mm.
we can deliver on in a really substantive fashion.
Wow. With MNGS, the technology, how widely used is it at the moment, and sort of what's the landscape for that technology at the moment in terms of what you're not necessarily competing with, but maybe competing with? I'm sure people are using it for other things, but how widely adopted is that at the moment?
I would say we're in the early days.
Hmm.
Um, there's one other commercial company in the United States. Um, so it's a very, very early um, technology landscape. They're in a different indication.
Right.
So we're very early. I would say take the cancer analogy. We're in infectious diseases where cancer precision medicine was in the 2013 to 2015 range.
Right.
Um, so it's probably 10 plus years behind. And that's something I've talked about a lot is, having this vision of bringing infectious diseases into the genomics era, the same way we've seen, tremendous success with cancer precision medicine, the same way there's been tremendous success with genetic screening, non-invasive prenatal testing, pharmacogenomics, where those have had real impacts on patients over a decade plus at this point. The evidence just isn't there for infectious diseases. There's been, to the credit of my founders and another company, um, that's it, basically. It's
Mm,
really been two groups who've driven this forward very, very substantively, and really no one else. Versus, you see cancer testing. There's an entire industry and a quite
yeah,
complex competitive landscape built up around it.
yeah, that's awesome. What's the story been so far then, Brad? I think you mentioned you'd launched in 2023. What's the sort of last 2 years been up until now? Where are you now, and what does the future look like?
Yeah, so we spent 2023 building the team, really focused, team building, early platform work, just getting ourselves on a very solid foundation.
Mm,
Um, and then last year, 2024, was spent focused on getting the product out the door, which we did late last year. So we had our commercial launch of what had previously been the UCSF cerebral spinal fluid metagenomic sequencing test, and is now Delft Detect CSF. So we launched that late last year, nationwide to a large number of hospitals, um, and have since then really been focused on, you know, a handful of different things, commercialization of that assay, um, being operationally excellent there. We're delivering turnaround times, well under 48 hours for a send out test, which is pretty outstanding. If you look at any other send out next generation sequencing assay. Um, but we view that as something that these patients need. It gets back to executing on patient need. Central nervous systems are, you know, can be profoundly detrimental to patients, not just in the near term, but the long-term disability that can also come from it.
mm,
And being able to deliver quicker is meaningful there. You can prevent disability. Um, so we've been focused really on being exceptional in just getting tests to patients. So that's really been the focus on Delve Detect CSF. And then the other two things that we think are kind of core pillars of what we do here at Delve is evidence generation, and thinking very big and very broad about how we do that. How do we build data sets and evidence and studies to support use cases, adoption, reimbursement, everything really, um, in the near and longer term for Delta Detect, not just Delta Detect CSF, but our future product portfolio.
mm,
So we've been thinking quite a bit about that. Um, I like to say drug like, drug light, as kind of our evidence standard. It's a very, very high standard, that transparently, I don't think a lot of the diagnostic industry is nearly as focused on building like absolutely bulletproof clinical data sets.
mm,
That's something I took away from my time as an investor is the data standard for a clinical trial for a drug company is very different. And for regulatory reasons, they should be. But for patient impact and utilization, I don't think they should be. And we want to be at that level. Uh, and then the last pillar is product development. Like I said earlier, we have this cool platform, the metagenomic next generation sequencing platform, the Delta Tech platform. Um, and while we're taking in cerebral spinal fluid now, it's it's something we've built in a modular manner so we can swap out CSF for joint fluid or respiratory fluid or ocular fluid or something of that nature in the longer term. And our vision and our mission here is to be able to offer a menu,
mm,
to be able to sit here and say, if a patient has let's say an ocular infection, which are rare and esoteric, but quite interesting to a lot of ophthalmologists out there.
yeah,
If they have that, we want to have a metagenomic sequencing assay for that.
right.
The same goes if they have a joint infection. We want to have that. So we want to be able to deliver a platform to people where if they have an infectious site, they can get a sample from that site and they can send it to us, and we have the ability to process it.
Wow. You obviously mentioned at the top of the conversation in terms of this emphasis on execution and therefore being attractive in investors' eyes. And you've mentioned again there about being excellent in commercialization and operationally. So in terms of the way you're running the business, what do you mean by that? Because that doesn't actually come up. Sometimes that's a bit of an afterthought, isn't it? And I think that's a problem, that there's so much emphasis on the science that people or of early stage founders forget they're running businesses, and excellence, they think excellence will come or operational excellence will come. But you've emphasized it again there. What does that mean to you, and what's going on at Delve that makes it operationally and commercially sound?
Well, being very metric driven. So sitting down and writing down with our team, what product attributes do we want to have? And then in our product development process, developing to those endpoints and sitting down and saying, after a development cycle, did we hit these things? Yes or no? Going through them line by line. And if the answer is no, we go back to the drawing board and we update it. We don't move forward in the next stage of development. We use a process called design control. That's an FDA regulated process. We're not an FDA regulated test. We're an LDT, but we think nonetheless design control is a very, very important tool in our toolkit. And so that's on the development side, but on the operation side, the execution side, it's same metric driven processes. So sitting down and saying, what's our turnaround time? How many tests have we had to issue failure codes or TNP codes, or how many tests have deviated from process, and setting standards and meeting those standards. And if we don't meet those standards, figuring out what needs to change to meet those standards. So really emphasizing that those metrics are actually your most important metrics, is something that we do quite a bit of. We've done a lot of work on the software side to make sure we have good visibility and an ability to measure those things. But just being very, very focused on that. Those are our most important metrics, and we have to live and breathe by them.
Yeah, that's awesome. What does the future milestones look like? You've mentioned, obviously, you're an LDT at the moment. Do you have a pathway to sort of FDA approval? You've mentioned reimbursement, and obviously just, becoming the standard of care. What does the sort of future look like?
Yeah, the regulatory path is an interesting one. I'm not sure we're totally ready to comment on that. I will say we did receive a breakthrough device designation from the FDA while this platform was still at UCSF, actually, and came over to Delve vis-a-vis our license from UCSF.
Yeah.
But the future for us, it's those three pillars, David. It's being operationally excellent and getting product to patients.
Yeah.
It's tremendous amount of focus on evidence generation, and it's building that product pipeline and really with the North Star of having that menu. Reimbursement's a very interesting one these days, because most of our patients are in the inpatient setting. It's something that we can handle in a pretty straightforward manner. But longer term, getting to work with payers, I think will be, really grossly benefited by this emphasis on evidence. I think we probably have, if I look at it, one of the best, if not the best, body of evidence of any 2.5-year-old startup. I would put ourselves against the best there, and I give my founders a lot of credit for this. There's a decade's worth of data, a handful of New England Journal papers, couple clinical trials, 5,000 patients of real world evidence in Nature Medicine.
Wow.
It's very, very robust. And I think when we do go to payers, that'll pay gross dividends. That level of evidence, that's really what they want, is okay, tell me how this is going to help, which is why I want to pay for it. Tell me what costs this might be able to avoid, which is why I want to pay for it. And I think we'll have all of that evidence in droves, um, given what we have done previously and what we're focused on today.
Yeah, wow. You mentioned the original founders in the academic side who have spent a long time gathering that evidence. What was their intent at the time? Was that something that they were looking super long term and in believing that was the right way to found a business, or was there a sort of a different motive at the time that they were pursuing?
No, it's never been about a company.
Right.
So it's, and I'll kind of tell you the history is, so Joe DeRisi, who's, you know, one of the world's great infectious disease geneticists. He's the president of the Chanzuk Biohub in San Francisco. He's a UCSF investigator. He's absolutely exceptional. Um, and 20 years ago and change at this point, Joe was actually using a microarray. He printed a microarray with a bunch of viral sequences. He called it the ViraChip. And the first SARS coronavirus outbreak had happened in China, and Joe actually was able to get samples from Chinese investigators and run his ViraChip. And he
Mm,
actually figured out that this mysterious respiratory illness was actually a coronavirus. This was before coronavirus was a household name.
right.
Um, and fast forward probably 10 years, Joe had 10 years from that, Joe had two postdocs, two fellows. Michael Wilson, who's also one of our co-founders, um, who's a neurologist, neuro ID doc, and Charles Chu, who's a infectious disease physician, laboratory medicine expert. And because of Mike's clinical interest in central nervous system infections and Charles' ability to actually build these assays and build these bioinformatics platforms, um, they started getting to work, and it was driven purely by the two of their skill sets
Yeah.
and the patients that they see. That's really what drove this technology development. And the story has been told many times before. They were built this platform in Joe's lab, um, and then Mike had a really sick patient. It was
Mm,
a young boy with a immunocompromised condition who had progressed with central nervous system infection to the point of ending up in a medically induced coma. Um, and, had been negative for 40 or 50 microbiological tests, had, I think, 4 lumbar punctures, had had a brain surgery, had a
mm,
shunt put in for hydrocephalus. Really, this is as severe of a central nervous system infection patient as you could possibly get. And they got special ethical exemption from UCSF to use a research tool in clinical practice here.
mm,
Um, and what they found is a very rare but a treatable bacteria. So they were able to actually treat this young boy who largely resolved his symptoms and was able to walk out of the hospital. And that was patient number 0 for Delve Bio, frankly, um, and for our platform at UCSF. And that's been a very important moment. But it goes back to Mike and Charles sitting there and saying, well, how can we help this patient? That's that's the cornerstone of the question.
yeah.
It's not, it's patient first, patient need first. What
Yeah.
can we do to help them? Um, versus, you know, having a technology and finding a patient you can help. It's, we have a patient. What's the best tool for this patient?
Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you, Brad, for the history on that. That's so good. So, um, I mean, it's super exciting. It's super exciting to hear the delve plans, the science, but also the way you guys are going about and to use the emphasis of execution. How you guys are executing at the moment is just incredible to see. Um, What's your objective overview on the sort of diagnostics and omics market at the moment, and where we are and what we're seeing in the future?
That's a good question. It's a big question. I think as a general comment, the market is the same way with all of the life sciences, is not in the greatest of places, but I do think
Yeah,
it's improving. Um, we've seen a couple very successful IPOs. We've seen some nice financings. Um, we continue to see innovation both in next generation sequencing, but also in point of care. There's been a lot of work done there. And I think there are a lot of very interesting companies doing important things for patients in that space.
yeah,
Um, but at the end of the day, I think there's two kind of things that I believe will drive success. It's people who are truly innovating and driving new applications and clinical uses, um, and are not simply kind of a me too, a better, faster PCR,
yeah,
but people who, like Delve, are trying to flip the story on its head and go from a hypothesis driven to a hypothesis free paradigm. It's people who are really pioneering big, impactful new use cases here. Um, those are the folks that I think will win. And that can happen in next generation sequencing, that can happen in point of care. Um, that can happen kind of even with at-home diagnostics. It can happen very, very broadly. And I think there are a lot of folks, interesting companies doing exactly that. Um, and then the other part is back to the execution. You're going to hear me hammer this home is, you know, the winners will be those people driving new use cases and new uptake who can
mm,
execute. Uh,
mm,
I think there's actually quite a few number of really, really interesting ideas that don't get delivered on. Um, and, but the people who can put those two things together, I think are going to get rewarded in droves, because they'll be meeting clinical needs. I think one space I'll highlight that I personally think is interesting is this super rapid sepsis market that's starting to develop. Um, and those are rapid, cheap point of care. Um, but that's a new use for those ERs and EDs. And I
mm.
think it's quite interesting. I think they will certainly get there. But they have to execute, and that's a tough execution play.
I think because of where you sit now, and what Delve have already been able to achieve in such a short amount of time, as a as a formed business company, um, and also your background and the perspective that you bring to the table, I believe you. And I love your emphasis on execution, because I just don't think we hear it enough from founders or early stage C-suite execs. There's a lot of emphasis on the science and how it could impact patients, but everyone has the dream that they will impact a patient population. But I genuinely believe that we don't have enough emphasis on execution. I love that you continuously execute or emphasize execution, but also are living it and breathing it right now. I think it's a fascinating perspective on how companies and early stage companies can survive and thrive in this landscape. It's fascinating. Well, Brad, I appreciate you coming on to share the Delve story, give an insight into yourself and how you guys are setting yourselves up for success. It's been really insightful. I really appreciate it.
Of course, David, it's the pleasure's been mine, and really thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Brad.